The rain had stopped just before dusk, leaving the ground slick and gleaming beneath the searchlights that stood silent for now, their lenses covered against the damp. The anti-aircraft battery near Rouen sat like a scar across the rolling French fields. Concrete, steel, and the exhausted souls of 20 men who had long since forgotten what peace felt like. The year was 1942, the heart of the storm, and for the men stationed there, the war had become less a series of battle and more an unending cycle of waiting, watching, and fearing what came next. They called themselves the Black Eyes of Rouen, though there was no pride left in it. Most of them had been boys when they joined, but now, even the youngest carried the weight of something far older, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, and the constant hum of engines somewhere far beyond the clouds. Inside the bunker, cigarette smoke hung heavy in the stale air. The men huddled near the oil stove, passing a dented tin of coffee that tasted more of metal than beans. Someone joked about how long it had been since they'd seen the sun. No one laughed. Outside, the night stretched wide and empty, filled with the quiet dread that always came before a raid. They'd heard the warning reports earlier in the evening. Scouts on the coast had picked up movement, something heading inland from the channel, too high and too slow to be fighters. The lieutenant, a sharp-nosed man named Bauer, had dismissed it at first. Probably Wellingtons again, he'd said. But even as he spoke, there had been a tremor in his voice. By midnight, the wind had died completely. The only sound was the ticking of the radio set and the occasional cough from one of the men half asleep at his post. Müller, the oldest of the crew, sat outside near the gun emplacement, looking toward the west. He'd been in France since 1940, had seen Dunkirk's fires from a distance, and had watched the sky rain down death more times than he cared to remember. But that night, something was different. He could feel it, though he couldn't have said why. The air itself seemed charged, as if holding its breath. Even the animals had gone quiet. Then it came, a sound so low and distant at first that it barely seemed real. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a fighter, or the uneven drone of the twin-engine bombers they'd grown used to. This was deeper. It rumbled through the earth before it reached the ears, a slow, rhythmic pulse that rolled across the landscape like a heartbeat from something colossal. Müller straightened in his seat, his cigarette slipping from his fingers. Inside the bunker, men looked up from their cards. "Was es das?" someone asked. No one answered. The sound grew stronger. The walls began to vibrate faintly, dust falling from the ceiling. Bauer shouted for positions, his voice cutting through the sudden chaos. Boots thudded on concrete as men scrambled out to their guns. The floodlights snapped on, throwing long white beams into the black sky. They cut through mist and cloud, searching for movement. For a moment there was only the echo of the engines and the soft clatter of belts being loaded into the 88mm guns. Then the sky broke open. Through a gap in the low clouds, they saw it, massive, black, and crawling slow across the heavens, like a moving piece of the night itself. The shape was wrong for a Wellington, wrong for a Halifax. It was larger, with a broader wingspan, and 4 engines burning steady, each one glowing faintly red as it carried its load toward Rouen. The Lancaster. They didn't know its name yet, but they would never forget that sound. The men opened fire. The first shells burst too low, painting the clouds orange. The guns thundered again, faster now, their rhythm desperate and uneven. Sparks leapt from the muzzles, the air filled with smoke and dust. The bomber didn't flinch. It held its course, a dark titan in the sky, moving with terrifying calm. Each time the flak burst near it, the light only revealed its immense silhouette. 4 engines, a vast fuselage, a creature born for destruction. Inside the cockpit of that plane, 7 men were focused, sweating, breathing through their oxygen masks, feeling every explosion as a tremor through the metal beneath them. But down below, in that small patch of French countryside, the gunners felt something else entirely. Fear, the kind that crawled into the gut and stayed there. It wasn't that they hadn't seen bombers before, it was that this one looked invincible. A near miss rocked the air, sending shards of shrapnel raining over the battery. One gun crew ducked instinctively. Another kept firing blind through the haze. "Keep shooting!" Bauer shouted, his voice cracking. Müller fired again, his ears ringing so loud he couldn't tell if the gun was working or not. Then came the first bombs. They didn't fall on the battery, they were aimed for the city. Far away, the horizon flashed white, then orange, then red, as Rouen began to burn. The bomber passed overhead, its engines now a deafening roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. Some of the men dropped flat, covering their heads. Others ran for cover behind the concrete wall, shouting over the thunder. "It's right above us!" one screamed, but no one could hear him. When the sound finally began to fade, the men didn't rise immediately. They waited, listening to the echo of it, that deep, steady pulse that had turned their confidence into ash. Bauer looked up, his face pale and wet with sweat. "That," he muttered, almost to himself, "was not a Wellington." The others didn't respond. The searchlights flickered off one by one, and the darkness swallowed them again. Somewhere far above, the Lancaster was already turning back toward the channel, its mission done, its engines fading into the mist. Müller sat down on the wet ground, his rifle resting across his knees. He stared at the empty sky, still feeling the vibration of that sound in his bones. He realized then that something had shifted, not just in the war, but in their understanding of it. The Allies had built something beyond imagination, something that didn't fear the flak or the guns or the night. And for the first time, the men of that anti-aircraft crew didn't feel like defenders. They felt hunted. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These stories always reach farther than the sound of those engines ever did. Dawn came grey and heavy, dragging its light reluctantly over the shattered horizon. The men of the Rouen battery had not slept. Their faces were colourless, their uniforms streaked with soot, eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. The air still smelled of burned oil and cordite. Somewhere to the east, the city was still smouldering, columns of smoke climbing lazily into the sky like black fingers pointing upward to whatever gods still watched. The night before had carved itself into them. They had faced the enemy countless times before, but never like that. The sound of the Lancaster still echoed faintly in their minds, a ghostly thrum that refused to fade. They spoke little that morning. Words felt useless, like trying to name something too vast to understand. Bauer had gathered them just after first light. He stood in front of the main gun, helmet under his arm, his breath steaming in the cold. "We'll have new orders by noon," he said, though everyone could tell his confidence was thin. "We did our duty. The city took the worst of it, not us. We held position." But the men didn't nod or cheer. They just stared past him, toward the west, where the night had swallowed the bomber whole. The youngest of them, a boy barely 20, asked in a small voice, "What was it, sir?" Bauer hesitated. He didn't know. None of them did. When the trucks from headquarters arrived, the officers who stepped out looked grim. They carried papers and photographs, reconnaissance shots taken from the city outskirts, whole districts flattened, warehouses reduced to splinters, railway lines twisted into knots of metal. One of the officers laid the photos across the ammunition crate like playing cards. "This was one raid," he said. "One bomber group. They call them Lancasters." The name hung in the air, heavy and final. Someone exhaled sharply. Müller leaned closer to the photo, his eyes narrowing. He could see the craters, the black scars on the landscape he'd once known well. He recognized the street where his cousin had lived before being evacuated. Nothing remained but rubble. For the rest of that day, they worked in silence, cleaning guns, checking the generator, repairing the damage from their own recoil. But every so often, one of them would pause and glance upward, as if expecting the sky to open again. Fear had a way of lingering in the small moments, in the sound of the wind through the radio wires, in the tremble of the ground when a distant train passed. The men began to understand what it meant to fight something unseen, something that could arrive from nowhere and erase everything without warning. At dusk, Bauer received confirmation from command. The Lancasters were real, and more were coming. Intelligence reported that the British had been producing them in numbers, larger payloads, longer range, more speed. The officers spoke of countermeasures, new radar calibrations, fresh ammunition delivery, but the men didn't believe in any of it. They'd seen the sky burn and the bomber fly through fire untouched. No order, no new shell would change that image. That night, Müller found himself standing outside again, the cold biting through his coat. The city's glow still stained the horizon, a dull orange. He could smell the distant smoke, acrid, metallic, full of loss. He thought of his wife back home, of the letters he never sent, of the child who might not even remember his face. Around him, the others had gone quiet, lost in their own thoughts. The silence of soldiers after a defeat was a strange thing. Not loud, not angry, but hollow, like a field after harvest. Then, faintly, he heard it again. Not the engines, but the memory of them, carried by imagination or fear. A deep hum, too slow to be real, but enough to tighten his chest. He turned his eyes upward, half expecting to see that black silhouette once more. Nothing, only stars. Yet still, he couldn't shake it. The sky no longer felt safe. It was a ceiling that could collapse at any moment. Inside the bunker, Bauer wrote the report. his hand trembling slightly. Enemy bomber, type unknown, presumed heavy 4-engine, engaged with all guns, no confirmed hits. Morale affected. He paused at the last words, then crossed them out. But it was true. Morale was gone. The men now looked at their weapons differently, not as shields, but as fragile tools against a storm they could never stop. Hours passed. The night deepened. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled, or maybe it wasn't thunder at all. Müller listened, waiting, his heart already braced for the sound he dreaded and missed all at once. The sound that had changed everything. The sound of power so immense it made men hide like children. The sound of the Lancaster. It wasn't just a machine, it was a reminder. The Germans had once believed the sky belonged to them, not anymore. And if you've been following this story, take a moment to subscribe. There's more coming, and each story carries the echoes of those who lived through nights like this. The second night came with no warning. The men had barely finished repairing the flak guns when the alarms began to wail again. It was just past 10, a thin mist crawling through the trees, the kind that swallowed sound and light alike. Bauer was in the command bunker, poring over new coordinates from headquarters. When the siren's cry cut through the air, he froze. Not again, not so soon. Outside, boots thudded across the wet earth. The crew scrambled into positions, helmets clattering, voices rising in confusion and disbelief. The previous night had left them frayed. Now, fear twisted their movements into frantic gestures. "Positions! Schnell!" Bauer shouted, forcing his voice over the din. The men obeyed, though many hands trembled as they loaded the belts. The radar operators had spotted the formation first, multiple blips approaching from the northwest, steady, deliberate, moving in perfect formation. It wasn't one bomber this time, it was many, a squadron. Each dot on the green screen pulsed with its own death sentence. Müller felt his stomach turn when the operator whispered, "A dozen, maybe more." The men exchanged looks that said everything words could not. A dozen of those monsters, a dozen engines, times 4. The sky itself would shake. By 10:20 they could hear it, not just a distant hum now, but a rising tide of thunder rolling over the fields. The ground began to tremble, small stones dancing across the bunker floor. Bauer stepped outside, the night pressing close around him, and for a brief moment he saw nothing, just clouds moving slow against a pale slice of moon. Then, one by one, the searchlights found their prey. Beams of white light clawed at the sky, crossing, sweeping, until they caught a shadow that seemed impossibly wide, and then another, and another. The Lancasters came in low and silent at first, but when the light hit their bellies, the world erupted. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire, the night flashing with bursts of orange and white. The air turned solid with noise. Explosions cracking, engines roaring, orders screamed into the chaos. Men shouted numbers, bearings, altitudes. Müller pulled the firing lever, feeling the kick of the gun jolt through his arms, the blast punching against his chest. His ears rang, but he kept firing, barely able to see through the smoke. The sky was alive, tracer rounds arcing upward, flak blooming in black flowers around the silhouettes of the bombers. Yet the enemy kept coming. Inside the lead Lancaster, the pilot held his course steady, sweat streaming down his face under the mask. The aircraft shuddered as bursts of flak exploded nearby, but it didn't falter. The bombardier called out targets below, rail yards, warehouses, fuel depots, all glowing faintly in the light of fires left from the night before. He could see the flak bursts rising toward them, blooming like dark petals. "Steady, steady," he muttered. At 12,000 feet, he opened the bomb bay doors. Below, the gunners saw the flash of light before they heard the sound. The first bombs fell with a strange, slow grace, tiny points of white descending into darkness. A few seconds later, the earth split open. The ground heaved, the shockwaves slamming through the gun positions, knocking men from their feet. Dirt, smoke, and pieces of steel rained down. The noise was beyond comprehension, one long, endless roar. Bauer screamed for them to keep firing, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. The air itself seemed to be on fire. Müller's gun jammed. He cursed, yanking at the mechanism, his fingers slick with sweat and grime. Another explosion sent him sprawling. He rolled over, coughing, ears ringing, and saw one of the younger soldiers lying still near the sandbags. His face turned toward the sky, eyes wide open. For a moment, Müller thought he was alive. Then he saw the dark pool beneath him. He wanted to move, to shout for help, but another wave of bombs thundered down, shaking the air to pieces. The whole world became motion and heat and sound. The Lancasters moved in waves. Each formation dropped its load, turned gracefully, and disappeared into the dark while the next wave took its place. The anti-aircraft guns blazed continuously until their barrels glowed red. The gunners' faces were black with soot, their mouths dry, throats raw from shouting. They could no longer tell if they were hitting anything or simply firing at the sky out of rage. The night had become endless. Far to the north, one bomber took a direct hit. Muller saw it happen. One of the searchlights caught it as flak burst beneath its wing. The aircraft jerked violently, fire spilling from its engine. The men below cheered weakly, their joy short-lived as the burning bomber descended in a slow, horrifying spiral. It passed directly over the battery, flames streaming behind it, before exploding in a deafening burst somewhere in the fields beyond. The shockwave threw everyone to the ground. The cheering stopped. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Even victory sounded like death. But the others did not stop. The bombers kept coming, a relentless procession of wings and thunder. Rouen was no longer a city. It was a furnace. The orange glow from the horizon turned the clouds blood red. Smoke rolled across the countryside, thick and choking. Muller could taste the ash on his tongue. He wiped at his face, smearing grime across his cheek. Bauer stumbled through the smoke, shouting for ammunition. The supply crates were half empty. The men fired in bursts now, conserving what little they had left. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The last formation turned northward, the sound of engines fading into the distance. The night fell quiet, except for the faint crackle of fire and the moans of the wounded. The men lowered their weapons one by one, the adrenaline draining from their bodies, leaving only exhaustion. Bauer leaned against the side of the bunker, his face pale and expressionless. "Rouen is gone," he whispered. Müller looked at him, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. They had fought with everything they had, and it had meant nothing. The bombers had flown through their defense as if it were made of paper. The guns had thundered. Men had died, but the sky remained unbroken. The power those machines carried was beyond anything they could comprehend. It wasn't just technology, it was inevitability. The war had shifted. The Germans, who had once ruled the air, were now prey to something larger, stronger, and unstoppable. As the fires burned on the horizon, Müller sat on an overturned crate, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He stared at the sky, still half expecting to see another dark shape gliding overhead. The silence was worse than the noise had been. It pressed in from all sides, heavy and final. He thought of home, of the farm near Kassel where his wife used to hang laundry in the summer wind, and for a moment he imagined he could hear the hum of bees in the fields. Then he realized it wasn't bees. It was memory. It was fear, eternal and echoing. When the medics arrived near dawn, they found the men scattered like shadows, too stunned to speak. The flak guns stood silent, their barrels tilted toward the empty heavens. The officers recorded the losses, the damage, the coordinates, as though numbers could explain what had happened, but none of it mattered. For those who had been there, the only thing they would remember was the sound, the deep, terrible hum of engines rolling through the darkness. The sound that meant death had learned to fly. And above it all, somewhere far beyond reach, the surviving Lancasters flew on toward the sea, their wings reflecting the faint light of the burning earth below. The morning after the second raid dawned in silence, the kind that made even the birds forget to sing. Smoke still hung low across the fields, curling in lazy ribbons that smelled of ash, cordite, and something sweetly rotten. The battery was unrecognizable. Craters pocked the earth where shells had fallen short, black scars stretching across what had once been rows of gun emplacements. Half the sandbags were torn open, spilling dirt like the insides of a wound. The air tasted of metal, and every breath felt like swallowing soot. The men moved through the wreckage in slow, mechanical motions, speaking little, their faces blank and grey. Bauer stood near what had been the command post, his coat smeared with mud and oil. He held a clipboard in one hand, but his eyes were elsewhere, on the twisted remains of the searchlight tower, on the bodies still covered with tarps. Müller approached him quietly, limping slightly from the blast that had thrown him down the night before. He waited for the lieutenant to speak, but Bauer only stared at the horizon, his jaw set, his lips trembling as if caught between rage and disbelief. "We hit one," he finally said, voice hoarse. "One bomber, maybe two. Out of all that." His hand shook as he gestured toward the sky, as though pointing at some invisible monster. "Do you understand, Müller? They flew through hell, and they kept flying. We hit one." Müller said nothing. There was nothing to say. He walked past the officer and looked out across the open field, where the frost was beginning to settle on the burnt grass. Somewhere beyond those hills, the survivors of the raid were already back in England, rearming, refueling, preparing to come again. The thought made him sick. Not because of hatred, he felt none anymore, but because of the futility of it all. Every shot they fired, every order they followed, it all ended the same way, in fire, noise, and the smell of death. As the day wore on, trucks arrived from headquarters carrying supplies, medics, and fresh recruits. The new men looked around the shattered battery with wide eyes, trying not to show their fear. They were boys, most of them, barely old enough to shave. They carried rifles that looked too big for their hands, and they spoke in quick, nervous bursts. One of them asked Müller if it was true that the British bombers flew with armour. Müller stared at him for a moment before answering. "They don't need armour," he said flatly. "They have engines that never stop." The boy didn't ask again. In the afternoon, the medics began removing the bodies. The air filled with the low hum of an engine that didn't belong to a plane, but still made every man look up. It was a truck, rumbling over the broken ground, carrying wooden coffins stacked like crates. Müller turned away. He'd seen too many of them already. Each time the lid closed on another friend, it felt like the earth itself was sealing something inside. A memory, a voice, a piece of what little humanity they had left. That night, the men gathered in the bunker again, though it felt different now. No one played cards. No one joked. They sat in silence, smoking in the dark, listening for sounds that weren't there. Every gust of wind became an engine. Every creak of metal made someone flinch. Fear had become a living thing among them, crawling under their skin, whispering that it would return, that low, terrible hum. Müller tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw the glowing bellies of the bombers drifting overhead, felt the tremor in the ground, heard the distant screaming of the city. In the early hours, Bauer received a coded message from command. "Prepare for further engagement. Reinforcements in transit. Hold Rouen sector." The words meant nothing. Rouen was gone. The city no longer existed as a place, only as a wound. The men who read the message didn't even bother to curse. They just stared at the radio, as if it were mocking. By dawn, the frost had thickened, turning the wreckage white. Müller stood beside one of the guns, running his hand over the cold metal, feeling the rough scars where the casing had split. He remembered when they'd first arrived, how proud he'd been to serve in the Luftwaffe's ground defense, how sure they all were that Germany could hold the skies forever. Those thoughts now felt like relics from another life. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke twist upward into the pale morning air. For a brief second, he thought he heard something, a faint vibration, a whisper of engines far away. He froze, holding his breath, but it was nothing, only the wind through the trees. Still, his heart pounded as if it were real. The men began calling it der Klang, the sound. It became a curse, a superstition. Even the officers used it in whispers. When the radar pinged, someone would murmur, "Der Klang kommt," the sound is coming. It wasn't the name of a plane anymore. It was the name of fear itself. Weeks passed, but the raids continued. The Lancasters came again and again, in waves that seemed endless. Sometimes they flew over Rouen. Sometimes they turned toward other cities, Amiens, Caen, Le Havre. But the battery always saw them, always heard them. Each time the men ran to their guns, fired into the darkness, watched the tracers vanish into the clouds, and prayed that at least one would fall. Sometimes they got lucky, most times they didn't. They learned to recognize the difference between a near miss and a direct hit by the way the earth moved beneath their feet. The war that had once felt like glory now felt like slow drowning. Even Bauer changed. He stopped giving speeches, stopped promising victory. He barely spoke at all. His face grew thinner, his eyes darker. One evening, Müller found him sitting alone beside the generator, staring into space. "Do you ever wonder," Bauer asked quietly, "how it feels for them? The men in those bombers, do they fear us the way we fear them?" Müller didn't answer. He didn't know if it mattered. By winter, the men no longer looked up at the sky with hatred. They looked up with resignation. The sound of engines had become the rhythm of their lives, their mornings, their nights, their dreams. When the hum began, their bodies reacted before their minds did, moving automatically to the guns, to the searchlights, to the hopeless routine that defined their existence. The war had become sound and smoke and waiting for the next thunder to fall. And as Rouen lay buried beneath its own ashes, the battery stood as a monument to defiance that meant nothing. The men were alive, but they were ghosts already, their hearts tuned forever to the echo of those engines that once rolled across the sky and made the whole world tremble. Now tell me, if you had been standing there that night, would you have fired at the sky or run for cover? Comment below with the words, "I heard the sound." Winter settled like a weight over northern France, muffling the ruins beneath frost and silence. The air grew still, but peace never came with it. The war continued somewhere beyond the horizon, but for the men of the Rouen battery, it had shrunk to the space between each raid, the long sleepless hours of waiting for the sound that had burned itself into their memory. The days blurred together in grey and brown. Smoke no longer rose from the city. There was nothing left to burn. What remained were hollow shells of building, the skeletons of factories, the twisted ribs of bridges stretching across the river, like the bones of drowned giants. Müller no longer counted the days. He didn't mark the calendar pinned to the wall of the bunker, though someone had scratched dates it until the pencil broke. It didn't matter. Each sunrise looked the same, cold, dim, and heavy with the promise of more skyfire. He'd grown quiet since the last bombardment, his words reserved only for necessity. He still did his duties with precision, cleaned the guns, checked the alignment, distributed ammunition, and obeyed Bauer's orders without question. But the light behind his eyes had dimmed, as if every hour spent under that constant threat stripped away another piece of the man he used to be. The new recruits, those sent to replace the dead, often tried to speak to him. They were boys from small towns, faces still round with youth, curious about everything, proud to be soldiers. They asked about his medals, about what it felt like to fire at a bomber, about whether the rumours were true, that the British flew through their flak laughing, unafraid. Müller answered them with the same simple phrase every time. "It's not courage," he said. "It's duty, and it kills you slower than a bullet." The recruits laughed awkwardly, not sure whether it was a joke. They stopped asking after a while. Bauer had changed too. The lieutenant who once barked orders with sharp precision now spent his nights hunched over the radio, chain-smoking until dawn, listening to the static between transmissions. Sometimes Müller would find him there, staring at the signal light as if waiting for it to blink with something other than bad news. The sound of the Lancasters had become an obsession for Bauer. He claimed he could tell the difference between them and other planes by the rhythm of the engine, could predict their path by the tone of the hum. "You can hear the weight," he muttered once, eyes unfocused. "You can feel it before it arrives." The others thought he was losing his mind. Müller wasn't so sure he wasn't right. The men slept in shifts. Some didn't sleep at all. The sound haunted their dreams. Low, steady, unrelenting. When it wasn't there, the silence hurt more. A few of the soldiers started drinking whatever they could find. Fuel, alcohol, medicine, even melted frost with gun oil mixed in. Anything to dull the nerves. The chaplain from the nearby infantry outpost visited once, offering prayers and promises of divine protection. The men laughed him out of the bunker. "God doesn't fly in formation," one of them said, and the chaplain never returned. On a rare clear afternoon, when the sky was blue and unbroken, Müller walked to the edge of the nearby field, where the wreckage of the downed Lancaster still lay half buried in frost. It had fallen weeks before, during the raid that tore the heart out of Rouen. The flames had long since died, but the twisted skeleton of the bomber remained, a massive carcass of blackened aluminum and shattered glass. Crows perched on the wings, pecking at the bits of fabric still caught in the rivets. Müller stood before it, feeling small. He could still see the insignia faintly through the soot, a faded roundel of red, white, and blue. He walked closer. The ground crunched under his boots. He could smell the burnt oil, sharp and acrid, even after all this time. Inside the fuselage, pieces of clothing hung from torn metal, and in one corner he found a boot, its leather scorched. He stared at it for a long time. Then he reached out and touched the cold surface of the wing. It was smooth in some places, jagged in others, but what struck him most was how human it felt, how deliberate, how crafted. This wasn't a monster. It was a creation. Someone, somewhere, had built it with their hands, with purpose and pride. Someone else had flown it through fire and death, and now it lay here, as broken as the men who had shot it down. That night, Müller couldn't sleep. He sat outside the bunker, watching the frost shimmer under the moonlight. He thought about the men who had been in that plane, whether they had known they were doomed when the flak burst below them, whether they'd been afraid, whether any of them had survived the fall. The idea haunted him more than the raids themselves. He imagined them sitting in their cockpit, breathing through masks, hearing the same sounds he did, but from the other side of the sky. He wondered if they had looked down and seen the flashes of the guns, the bursts of light that marked the place where he stood, and if, just for a second, They had felt pity. War, he realized, was not two sides fighting each other. It was two sides enduring the same endless terror, mirrored across the heaven. The only difference was who stood above and who below when the thunder came. When he returned to the bunker, Bauer was awake, staring at the map pinned to the wall. "They'll hit us again before the month ends," he said without turning. "Intelligence says they're moving farther south. Rouen just a waypoint now." His voice cracked. Müller looked at him and saw a man hollowed out by too many nights of waiting, too many reports filled with numbers that meant lives. He wanted to tell him to rest, but what would be the point? Rest didn't matter when the sound would always come back. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, slow flakes drifting through the air like ashes. It covered the ground gently, hiding the craters, the wreckage, the stains. For a moment, the battery looked peaceful, almost beautiful. The men stood quietly, watching it descend. And then, faintly, somewhere in the distance, they heard it again. A low vibration, faint but unmistakable. No one spoke, no one moved. The snow kept falling. The sound grew louder. The snow did not stop for 3 days. It fell endlessly, muting the world beneath a fragile white shell. The guns stood like black skeletons against the pale drifts, their barrels dusted with frost, their silence heavier than any explosion. For a time, it felt as though the world itself had been paused, waiting for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe annihilation. The men moved slower, their breath steaming in the cold, their boots crunching over frozen mud. Rouen ruins were now nothing but mounds of ice and shadow. Only when the wind blew from the east could they smell what lay buried beneath, the ghost of smoke, the faint metallic tang of burned steel and flesh. Inside the bunker, the stove barely worked. The men huddled close, wrapped in blankets that stank of oil and sweat. The new recruits whispered about home, about families they hadn't heard from in months, about rumors of retreats farther east. No one dared say it aloud, but they all felt it. The war was turning. The British bombers came with greater frequency now, the raids larger, the nights longer. Sometimes, whole squadrons passed overhead without even dropping bombs, as if just to remind them who owned the sky. Bauer no longer shouted orders when the alarm sounded. He simply stood, straightened his coat, and gave the command quietly, as if walking to the gallows. Müller had stopped thinking of the raids as battle. They were visits. Each time the sound returned, he felt like a condemned man hearing the footsteps of his executioner approach from down a long corridor. The sound had changed somehow, deeper, more layered, as though the bombers themselves were multiplying in the dark. Sometimes, when he listened hard enough, he thought he could hear voices inside that sound, distant and human, men speaking through the hum of engines. He would close his eyes and imagine he could understand them. He wondered if they could hear him too, somewhere below the clouds. A man not so different, both trapped in the same endless circle of death. On the 4th night of snow, the radar operator caught a signal, faint, far, but moving closer. Bauer didn't need confirmation. He stepped outside, looking toward the horizon, his face illuminated by the thin blue glow of the equipment behind him. The others followed, their boots crunching softly in the snow. The night was clear. Stars glittered like shards of ice. And then the sound came again, that deep, slow rhythm of engines cutting through the cold. The men froze. Müller felt it in his chest before he heard it in his ears. The vibration moved through the ground, through the soles of their boots, through the walls of their bones. "To positions," Bauer said quietly. They moved like men in a dream. The guns groaned as they turned, their gears stiff with frost. Ammunition belts clattered into place. The men's breath came in sharp clouds. Somewhere far above, invisible against the stars, the Lancasters droned in perfect unity, engines synchronized like a single heartbeat. When the first searchlight found one, it appeared not as a plane, but as an apparition, vast, silver, gliding without effort. For a brief moment, Müller forgot to breathe. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching lightning frozen in time. Then, the first shell fired, and the world cracked open again. The air erupted with thunder. Flak burst across the heavens, black clouds blooming around the bombers. The guns roared, echoing through the valleys, shaking the snow from trees. The men screamed over the noise, shouting bearings and distances. Bauer moved between them, his face lit by the flashes of fire, his voice raw. Müller fired until his shoulders ached, the recoil slamming through him again and again. But no matter how much they fired, the bombers didn't fall. They flew through the explosions like ghosts, the light glinting off their fuselages before vanishing into the dark. Then came the counterstroke. The bombs fell in patterns, precise and merciless. The first wave struck the outskirts of the battery, lifting entire sections of earth into the air. The second hit closer. The blast threw Müller backward, slamming him against the side of the bunker. For a moment, everything went white. When he came to, his ears were ringing, and all he could hear was a distant muffled roar. He staggered to his feet, dazed, his vision swimming. The air was filled with smoke and snow. Flames licked the edge of one of the guns. Someone was screaming. He stumbled forward and found one of the recruits, Johann, the boy who had asked about the armoured bombers, lying half buried in the snow, one arm twisted at an impossible angle. His eyes were open, his lips moving without sound. Müller dropped to his knees, pressing a hand to the boy's chest, but there was nothing. Only the vibration of the ground, still trembling with the echo of engines. He sat there for a long time, not moving, not speaking. When he finally looked up, the sky was full of fire again. By the time the last bomber turned back toward the channel, the battery was gone. One gun destroyed, another buried. Half the men were dead or missing. The rest wandered through the wreckage like ghosts, faces lit by the glow of burning debris. Bauer's arm was bandaged, blood seeping through the cloth. He stood silently, watching the bombers fade into the distance. "They don't even need to aim anymore," he said softly. Müller didn't answer. For the next 2 days, they dug through the rubble, searching for the missing. The snow had melted into black slush, streaked with ash. They found what they could. Boots, helmets, a piece of a dog tag, fragments of flesh, frozen to the dirt. No one cried. They were past that. Grief had become as mechanical as their routines. At night, Müller sat beside the broken gun, staring at the empty sky. He thought about Johann, about the crew of the downed Lancaster still half buried beyond the fields, about all the men on both sides who had become nothing but smoke and metal. He realized then that the war had no sides anymore. There were only the living and the gone. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he still heard the engine, not from above, but from within. A low, endless hum, like a second heartbeat. He began to wonder if he would ever stop hearing it, even after the war ended, if it ever did. The sound had burrowed too deep. It wasn't the enemy anymore, it was a part of him. When the thaw finally came, the snow melted into the black soil, leaving behind only the ruins of what had once been the Rouen battery. Spring crept in softly, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the far-off hum of river water flowing through broken bridges. The world outside was beginning to heal, but the men who remained were not part of that renewal. They were relics, half shadows, half memory, moving through what was left of their station like ghosts who didn't know they were dead. The guns were silent now. One had been dismantled, its pieces shipped east. Another lay cracked and useless, its barrel pointing at the sky as though still cursing the heavens. Müller spent his mornings walking the perimeter alone. The war had shifted again. The front was moving. The Luftwaffe stretched thin. They said reinforcements were coming, but everyone knew that meant replacements. Men too young to understand what the sound of engines could do to the mind. He would watch them arrive in their crisp uniform, full of naive pride, and he would see himself in them, as he once was, before he had learned that courage and fear could coexist in the same trembling heartbeat. Bauer was gone now, transferred after the last raid. They said he'd broken down during interrogation by higher command, repeating the same sentence over and over. They come from nowhere. Müller didn't blame him. In a way, Bauer had only said what all of them had been thinking. At night, when the wind was calm, Müller could still hear it, the ghost of that deep, steady hum. He knew it wasn't real. It was memory stitched into his nerves, a sound so powerful it refused to die, even when the sky was empty. Sometimes, in his dreams, he was back in the bunker, the lights flickering, the ground shaking, the air thick with dust and smoke. He would reach for the firing lever, pull, feel the recoil slam through him, and then he would wake up to silence, to frost on the window and the soft drip of melting snow. The silence hurt more than the sound ever had. He found himself wandering often to the field beyond the wire, where the wreck of the Lancaster still rested, though now the metal had turned dull and brittle with rust. Moss crept up its sides, and wildflowers pushed through its shattered hull. Nature had begun to reclaim what men had built to destroy. He would stand there for hours, watching bees crawl over the petals, hearing birdsong where once there had been fire. Sometimes he would speak to it, quietly, as though the dead could still hear. "You came for us," he would say, "and you never stopped coming." The wind carried his words nowhere, scattering them like ash. When the orders finally came to abandon the site, Müller packed what little he owned, a few letters, a photograph. his service cap, a pocket knife, and stood one last time before the broken guns. The new unit would arrive within days to take over what remained of the sector, though everyone knew it wouldn't matter anymore. The war was slipping through their fingers. The skies belonged to the bombers now. He looked around at the empty posts, at the silence that had replaced all the shouting, the fear, the fire. It felt wrong that the world could look so peaceful after so much noise. As he walked away, the sun broke weakly through the clouds. The light caught on the metal of the wrecked Lancaster, glinting once before fading again. For a heartbeat, he could almost see it whole. Wings unbroken, engines alive, moving through the dawn as it once had. He stopped, listening. The air was still. And then, faintly, from far beyond the horizon, came the low, distant murmur of engine. Not real, not possible, but it was there all the same. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He only stood and listened, the way a man might listen to a memory too precious to let go. The sound rose and fell, gentle now, almost kind, like the pulse of something eternal. Müller closed his eyes and let it fill him, not with fear this time, but with understanding. The war would end one day, but the sound would remain, in the sky, in the earth, in the bones of every man who had ever looked up and waited for the thunder to pass. And as he turned toward the road that led east, the fields behind him silent again, he knew that what haunted them all was not death itself, but the echo of what it left behind, the sound of power, of fate, of history, written in fire and steel. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe. There are countless echoes like this, still waiting to be